Welcome to a special deep dive from RWG Publishing. Today, we're embarking on a really crucial journey, exploring the very bedrock of American democracy, the First Amendment. Our guide for this fascinating exploration is the incredibly insightful book, Voices of Liberty, Navigating and Safeguarding the First Amendment by Bill Vincent. Our mission, it's really to arm you with a deep understanding of these fundamental freedoms. We'll go from their ancient roots right up to their modern challenges, basically giving you a shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Yeah, it's great to be digging into this. Bill Vincent's book, it's not just a history lesson, right? It's kind of an urgent reminder that our liberties are dynamic, always evolving, and, they really require our active participation to keep them safe. We'll be tracing the First Amendment's historical roots, looking at those key legal battles, and grappling with the modern-day challenges that are constantly testing its integrity. The goal is, well, a comprehensive understanding of these rights, fostering a deeper appreciation for freedoms we often take for granted, and really emphasizing our collective responsibility to protect them as, society and technology just keep marching forward.
Okay, so to really get the First Amendment, we need to trace its DNA, right? Stretching back way beyond America's shores, back to ancient civilizations that first started wrestling with this whole idea of open expression. Where do we see those first sort of glimmers?
Well, Athenian democracy in ancient Greece is a fascinating starting point. What's really interesting there is its inclusivity. I mean, for eligible male citizens anyway. Every one of them could actually participate in debates, vote on critical stuff, military strategy, legal reforms, you name it. And this active participation, it absolutely demanded a culture where speech could flow freely, no fear of retribution, public discourse, logos they called it basically,
Yeah.
reasoned argument and public debate was highly revered. It was seen as the tool for finding truth, for reaching consensus. So the core insight really is that free speech was just deeply woven into the idea of democracy itself. Demos Kratos, rule by the people, right? Their whole system hinged on open debates in the assembly. It fostered this cultural expectation that ideas had to be examined in public and, the best arguments would win out.
That's really powerful, that idea of public debate being absolutely essential for democracy. It feels like such a direct line to today. But what about the Romans? Did they build on this or take it in a different direction?
They did build on it, yeah. The Roman Senate, much like the Greek Agora, also valued free speech, particularly, for the political elite. Senators engaged in these really vigorous public debates on state matters. And there was an expectation that the best ideas would surface through debate and leaders would be held accountable.
Okay, but there's a but coming, I feel.
There is, yeah, and it's a crucial insight. This freedom definitely had limits. Just look at Cicero, executed under orders from Mark Antony because he fell afoul of political power struggles. It's a pretty stark reminder that in ancient Rome, free speech, especially if it seemed to threaten the political order, was only tolerated up to a certain point.
So that tension was there right from the start. Protecting expression versus maintaining order.
Exactly. It's a tension democracies are still grappling with. But, the Roman system did lay important groundwork. Formalized rhetoric, the right to self-defense in court, traditions that definitely influenced later governments, including the U.S.
Okay, so we've planted these ancient seeds. But then Europe enters the Middle Ages, a time we often think of as having much stricter controls, right? How did free speech fare then?
Well, the Middle Ages, yeah, often seen as a time of rigid religious authority and suppressing dissent. But paradoxically, it played a significant role. Maybe not always positive, but significant. The Christian church had immense influence. It became the main judge of what speech was okay. Heresy speech, challenging official church teachings, that was punished severely. Excommunication, prison, even execution through the Inquisition.
So the state got involved in controlling speech in a big way then.
Absolutely. That set a precedent. But even within that tight control, you had dissenting voices pop up. Figures like John Wycliffe advocating for translating the Bible into common languages. That was an early push for intellectual and religious freedom. And then the huge challenge, the Protestant Reformation, early 16th century. Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to that church door in 1517. That was a massive act of free speech against overwhelming authority.
And spread by the printing press, right? That must have amplified it enormously.
Oh, totally. Game changer. Suddenly, these ideas could spread far and wide much faster than before.
So these figures, even with the dangers, they started chipping away at that centralized control, setting the stage for, a massive shift in thinking. The Enlightenment.
Exactly. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, late 17th, 18th centuries, it was pivotal. It really flipped the script. You had this profound shift towards rational thought, scientific inquiry, skepticism of authority.
What was the single biggest idea connecting these thinkers, the one that really paved the way for the First Amendment?
I'd say it was the concept of free speech as an inherent natural right. Not just a privilege granted by a king or a church, but something you're born with. This made free expression a vital check against tyranny, not something authority could just hand out or take away. John Locke, in his two treatises of government, he really hammered this home free speech as fundamental for liberty. Voltaire, the French philosopher, fiercely championed the right to express unpopular views. You know his famous line, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Captures it perfectly.
And Montesquieu, separation of powers.
Right. Baron de Montesquieu's idea of separating powers in the spirit of the laws directly influenced the Founding Fathers. They saw it as key to limiting government control over speech and religion. This whole concept of checks and balances became fundamental to the U.S. Constitution, making sure no single entity could just dominate public discourse.
So these Enlightenment ideas weren't just philosophical musings, they directly fueled revolutions, didn't they?
Absolutely. The late 17th and 18th century saw huge upheavals. The Glorious Revolution in England, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, all of them drew heavily on this idea that free speech was essential for challenging tyranny, for setting up new governments based on the consent of the governed. And in the new American Republic, this demand for free speech found its ultimate expression.
Which brings us right to the First Amendment itself. It wasn't just plucked out of thin air then. It was a direct response, a culmination of centuries of thought and struggle. How did it specifically come together during America's founding?
Yeah, it was deeply influenced by all those intellectual currents we just talked about. The founders, they drew heavily from Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu. They wanted a system that secured citizens' rights and inherently limited potential government abuse. And the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists got pretty intense, you know. Several states basically said, no Bill of Rights, no ratification. They demanded safeguards for individual freedoms.
And Madison stepped up.
James Madison, yeah. He was initially a bit skeptical about needing a separate Bill of Rights, but he saw the necessity. He became a huge advocate and took on the task of drafting them in 1789. And importantly, his focus wasn't just on speech.
Right, because the language we know today protects both speech and religious freedom, side by side.
Exactly. The very first words reflect Madison's deep commitment to that. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's the Establishment Clause.
Preventing a national religion. Like the Church of England they'd known.
Precisely. It reflected his strong belief in separating church and state, and right after that, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the Free Exercise Clause.
Guaranteeing individuals can practice their religion without the government interfering.
Right. Madison's work, really influenced by folks like Thomas Jefferson and his Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, enshrined these twin freedoms, speech and religion, as core parts of the American experiment. It set this powerful precedent for a nation where, ideally, diverse opinions, beliefs, and faiths could all flourish together.
Okay, so the amendment is ratified. It's on paper. But even then, the early republic faced immediate tests, didn't it? Challenges that really forced people to figure out what these words meant in practice.
Oh, absolutely. Right off the bat, one of the most direct early assaults on press freedom was the Sedition Act of 1798. Passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress, it literally made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government.
Wow. So basically, criticizing the government could land you in jail.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The Federalists argued it was necessary for stability, but Jefferson and Madison fought back hard with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. They saw it for what it was, a blatant violation of free speech and press, a tool to silence political opponents. And that period really exposed this fundamental tension we still grapple with today, balancing government authority and individual liberty. Where's that line?
Any other early examples?
Yeah, People v. Croswell in 1804. It was a libel case against a newspaper editor who'd criticized President Jefferson. Again, highlighting this ongoing struggle to define the boundaries. The early press, you have to remember, was a really powerful, often kind of chaotic force. It shaped public opinion, held leaders accountable. These early fights were absolutely crucial in defining its role.
It's so clear these freedoms weren't just handed down. They had to be constantly fought for, defined, redefined. This deep dive, drawing from Bill Vincent's Voices of Liberty, has already uncovered such a rich and honestly sometimes surprising history, full of these tensions that still echo today. If you're finding this as fascinating as we are and you really want to get a handle on the evolution of these rights, you absolutely need to check out the full book. You can find Voices of Liberty by Bill Vincent on Amazon. We'll make sure to put a direct link right there in the show notes for you. It's genuinely a shortcut to getting properly informed on this vital topic.
Right. So moving into the 20th century, things get even more complex. Global conflicts start pushing the limits of free speech in totally new ways. How did World War I, for instance, test the First Amendment?
World War I was definitely a critical turning point. The U.S. government, feeling immense pressure, passed the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. The goal was to suppress dissent they saw as dangerous to the war effort. The defining legal challenge that came out of this was Schenck v. United States in 1919. Charles Schenck was convicted for distributing leaflets opposing the draft. The Supreme Court upheld his conviction unanimously, and in doing so, introduced a really monumental legal standard, the clear and present danger test.
Yes, Justice Holmes. Falsely shouting fire in a theater.
Exactly. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that famous line, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic." The core idea, the insight here, was that speech could be restricted if it directly incited harm or posed a serious immediate threat, especially during wartime.
Okay, so that clear and present danger test becomes a benchmark. But you mentioned earlier that the Bill of Rights initially only applied to the federal government. How did the First Amendment start applying to the states, too? That seems like a huge step.
It was massive. And that brings us to Gitlow v. New York in 1925, a total game changer. Now, the court actually upheld Gitlow's conviction he distributed a socialist pamphlet. But in the ruling, they introduced the doctrine of incorporation.
Incorporation, meaning?
Meaning the First Amendment's protections, free speech and free press, specifically in this case, which originally only restricted the federal government, now also applied to state governments. They did this through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, basically saying that liberty in that clause includes these fundamental First Amendment rights. It vastly expanded the reach of these protections across the whole country.
Wow. Okay, so that really opened the door for people to challenge state laws that might be infringing on these core freedoms. Huge implications. But what about expressing ideas without words, through action, symbolic speech? How did the court start thinking about that?
Great question. And that leads us straight to West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett in 1943, another landmark. This case dramatically expanded how the First Amendment was interpreted by establishing that symbolic actions like, in this case, refusing to salute the flag, were protected forms of free expression.
This was during World War II, right?
Yeah.
With Jehovah's Witnesses.
Exactly. West Virginia had a law requiring all public school students to salute the flag. Jehovah's Witnesses, whose beliefs forbid idolizing symbols like that, challenged it. And the Supreme Court, in a stunning reversal of an earlier decision called Gobitis, ruled in favor of the Barnetts. Justice Robert H. Jackson wrote this incredibly powerful defense of individual liberty. He said, "If there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion."
Or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. Powerful stuff.
It really is. The key insight is that freedom of speech includes the right to not speak, the right to refrain. It extended protection to nonverbal conduct, to symbolic acts.
So from these wartime debates, we then shift into another defining era where free speech became this incredibly potent tool for justice, the civil rights movement.
Yeah, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, it's arguably one of the most profound examples of how First Amendment protections for free speech and assembly were absolutely crucial in challenging deep-seated racial injustice. Leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they masterfully used public oratory. Think of the "I Have a Dream" speech during the March on Washington in '63, just inspiring hope, challenging the nation's conscience.
And it wasn't just speeches, right? It was actions, too.
Yeah.
Demonstrations.
Exactly. Mass demonstrations were vital. The Montgomery bus boycott, the Greensboro sit-ins started by students at that Woolworth's lunch counter, the peaceful protests in Birmingham in '63. Even though those Birmingham protests were met with such brutal force by Bull Connor, the images brought national and international attention to the sheer injustice of segregation.
So free speech here wasn't just about words, but the physical act of gathering, protesting, demonstrating. And I imagine authorities push back hard against that.
Oh, absolutely. Segregationist officials constantly tried to ban protests, using any excuse they could find. But the Supreme Court repeatedly stepped in. Cases like Edwards v. South Carolina in '63 said peaceful protesters couldn't be arrested just for expressing unpopular views. And Shuttlesworth v. City of Birmingham in '69 struck down a city ordinance that gave officials way too much discretion to just deny protest permits. It really emphasized the right to assemble.
And the press played a big role too, didn't it? Keeping these issues in the public eye.
Hugely important.
Yeah.
Which brings us to New York Times Company v. Sullivan in 1964. Monumental case. The Times had published an ad that was critical of the Montgomery police actions during civil rights protests. L.B. Sullivan, a public safety commissioner, sued for libel. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Times, and in doing so, it established the actual malice standard.
Meaning public officials couldn't just sue for anything negative said about them.
Right. They had to prove the statement was made with actual malice, meaning the publisher knew it was false, or acted with reckless disregard for whether it was false or not. This was huge protection for the press. It gave them breathing room to report on controversial issues like civil rights, without constant fear of crippling libel suits, even if they made an honest, factual error.
And that idea of symbolic speech we talked about with Barnett, the flag salute case, that must have come into play here too, right? Things like sit-ins.
Absolutely. Symbolic speech, those nonverbal actions like sit-ins, marches, wearing armbands, they conveyed incredibly powerful messages, sometimes more effectively than words. And the Supreme Court's ruling in Tinker v. Des Moines in '69 really cemented this. Now, Tinker was about students protesting the Vietnam War by wearing black armbands.
Students don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate.
Exactly. As long as the expression didn't cause a material and substantial disruption, it was protected. This provided really critical legal backing for civil rights activists engaging in peaceful defiance. And the legacy, the way the civil rights movement used free speech, it basically provided a blueprint for later social justice movements. Women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
They all draw on those hard-won First Amendment protections.
Okay, so bringing us closer to the present day. Free speech keeps evolving, keeps facing new and often really complex challenges. Let's talk about hate speech, always a contentious topic.
Yeah, it really is. And in the U.S., the First Amendment offers some of the broadest protections for expression in the world, which means it resists legal restrictions on speech that many would find offensive or harmful. The prevailing legal philosophy, often linked to Justice Brandeis, is this idea that the best answer to bad speech isn't censorship, but more speech, countering hateful ideas through open debate.
So a lot of what gets called hate speech in public discussion is actually constitutionally protected.
Largely, yes, unless it crosses a specific line into direct incitement of imminent violence or constitutes what the law calls a true threat. Look at Snyder v. Phelps in 2011. The Supreme Court ruled that the Westboro Baptist Church's incredibly offensive picketing of military funerals was protected speech because it addressed matters of public concern, however disagreeably, and was done lawfully on public property.
That's a really tough concept for a lot of people to accept, especially when speech causes such deep offense or emotional harm. Didn't the Skokie case push this boundary even further?
The Skokie case, National Socialist Party of America v. Village of Skokie from 1978, yeah, that profoundly tested the limits. You had a neo-Nazi group wanting to march through Skokie, Illinois, a town with a large number of Holocaust survivors. The village tried to stop them, arguing the march itself was like fighting words, causing psychological harm. But the courts ultimately ruled in favor of the neo-Nazis' right to march, finding the village ordinances unconstitutional.
Why? What was the core reasoning there?
The fundamental insight was that the government cannot restrict speech solely based on its content or the listener's reaction, no matter how offensive or disturbing that content is. The fear was, if you allow censorship based on offensiveness, you set a dangerous precedent that could easily be used later to suppress unpopular political dissent or minority viewpoints.
And the ACLU famously defended the Nazis' right to speak in that case, right? Based on that principle.
They did. It was hugely controversial, but their argument was based on that core principle. You have to uphold free speech for everyone, even those with abhorrent views, to protect the rights of all groups in the long run.
That tension, protecting free speech versus protecting communities from harm, it's incredibly clear there. And we see it playing out constantly on college campuses today, don't we?
Absolutely. Campuses are real hotspots for this debate. Attempts to implement campus hate speech codes have often run into legal trouble. In Doe v. University of Michigan back in 1989, a federal court struck down the university's policy. They found it was overly broad and vague, worried it could chill legitimate academic discussion and debate. It just highlights this ongoing dilemma. How do universities foster free inquiry, encourage robust debate, and ensure an inclusive, safe environment for everyone? especially when controversial speakers come to campus and spark protests, sometimes violent ones. It forces the question, where is the line between legitimate, if offensive, debate and unprotected hate speech or incitement?
And then you layer the internet and social media on top of all this, it just amplifies everything, right? How has the digital age completely reshaped this whole landscape?
Well, fundamentally, the internet created this massive, borderless public square. It amplifies positive voices, sure, but also harmful content at a scale and speed we've never seen before. Think about the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. A lot of that was organized and promoted online. It's a stark example of how digital rhetoric can spill over into real-world physical violence, even murder.
And content moderation is just incredibly complex, isn't it? Especially for global platforms.
Hugely complex
Okay.
because different countries have wildly different laws. Like you said, in the U.S., hate speech is mostly protected unless it incites violence. But in Germany, for example, laws strictly prohibit Holocaust denial or displaying Nazi symbols. Platforms operating globally have to navigate this minefield. And sadly, we've seen these tragic real-world consequences. The Charleston church shooting in 2015, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in 2018. In both cases, the perpetrators were found to have been radicalized, at least in part, by online hate speech. It just underscores how urgent this debate over legal limits and platform responsibility really is.
So looking ahead now, this landscape is changing so fast. What does it all mean for the future of the First Amendment, especially with technologies like AI coming into the picture?
Yeah, it's a huge question. Digital platforms, on one hand, they've empowered movements like #MeToo and Black Lives Matter, giving them global reach. That's undeniable. But they've also introduced new threats. Misinformation, disinformation, fake news, spreading like wildfire, often without the traditional media gatekeepers. We saw the impact in the 2016 U.S. election, for instance.
And governments using these platforms too, right, for surveillance and censorship.
Exactly. Authoritarian regimes leverage these tools very effectively. Think of China's Great Firewall and the future. It's going to be increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence and things like deepfake technology. AI-driven content moderation might help manage the sheer volume of online content, but it brings its own problems: algorithmic bias, mistaken censorship, and deepfakes. They have the potential to manipulate reality, to completely undermine public trust in what we see and hear. That's a scary prospect for informed public discourse.
It really sounds like the Supreme Court and honestly societies everywhere have some major challenges ahead, constantly trying to find that balance between security and liberty in this new context.
Absolutely. The court's role as the guardian of the First Amendment remains critical. It's going to keep having to weigh security against liberty, address new threats like cyberterrorism and foreign election interference, and it will have to figure out how, or even if, you can regulate things like AI and deepfakes without totally stifling legitimate expression. Plus, the ideological makeup of the court itself always plays a role in how it interprets free speech in different areas: religion, campaign finance, government power, corporate speech.
Okay, so given all these complex challenges, technological shifts, legal battles, what can we as individuals actually do? It can feel a bit overwhelming. What's our role in protecting these freedoms moving forward?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? And it's not just about laws and courts. It's also about social reforms, about our own actions. We definitely need stronger privacy protections in this digital age. More control for individuals over their data, limits on surveillance, that's foundational. But equally important, maybe more so, is fostering a culture that genuinely values open dialogue, even when ideas make us uncomfortable.
How do we do that practically?
Well, it means things like prioritizing media literacy and critical thinking skills in education. We all need the tools to navigate this incredibly complex information environment, to tell fact from fiction, to spot manipulation. And it means promoting tolerance, actually engaging with diverse viewpoints, even the ones we strongly disagree with, rather than just trying to shut them down or censor them.
So countering hate speech, with better arguments rather than just bans.
Ideally, yes. It's about finding that balance. Countering harmful speech effectively without undermining the broader right to free expression for everyone. It often means, paradoxically, defending the right to speak for those whose ideas we find most repellent, to ensure that right remains secure for all voices.
What an incredible and honestly complex journey we've taken through the evolution and challenges of the First Amendment. From ancient Greece right up to the AI-driven future, Bill Vincent's book, Voices of Liberty, really does illuminate both the enduring power and the fragility of these essential rights. If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, and you really want to keep exploring these intricate legal battles, the cultural impacts that shape our freedoms, we definitely recommend getting your own copy. Like we said, you can find Voices of Liberty on Amazon, and that link is right there in our show notes for you.
Absolutely. The First Amendment, it isn't just some dusty historical document. It's a living, breathing principle, and it really demands our continuous engagement, our attention. So the question for you is, what actions will you take to help safeguard this marketplace of ideas for future generations? Thank you for listening to the Deep Dive Podcast.